Chapter 305. The Enslaved Bride, Part 2. On the day on which the bride was expected to arrive, Malwal woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and went to the airport to receive his beloved, Ayan. He ironed his clothes carefully, bathed and shaved so his bride would see him as the most handsome guy at the airport. Malwal was in fact a tall and good-looking young man with a strong athletic body. He had reached 24 years old when he married Ayan. That age was considered to be very late in his village for a man to wed. Usually, boys would get married as soon as their voices deepened, while girls would be given in marriage any time after she became 9 years old. About 30 Sudanese men and 40 women along with their little ones, accompanied Malwal to the airport. In his apartment, in church, and in the reception hall, Malwal had spent a lot of money to impress his beautiful bride. The Sudanese women cooked 4 sheep and 100 chickens to prepare for the big feast. Besides that, all kinds of hot and soft drinks were bought. So, Malwal needed to work continuously for 5 years to clear his debts, and then only if he worked 2 jobs in the day. The plane landed as scheduled at 7 o'clock in the morning. When the passengers began to trickle into the arrival hall, Malwal's eyes were like a camera zoomed in and focused. Every image of a female that did not match the cacao color of his expected bride, he chased out of his vision as the sun would chase a passing cloud. Even after every passenger had disappeared, Malwal and the 70 Sudanese people still continued to look for the miraculous appearance of the beautiful bride. They stood and waited for a long time before they accepted the bitter truth: the bride was not in the plane. If the president of the Sudanese Association had said that the plane arrived without a pilot, Malwal's mind and heart might have accepted such a possibility, but not that Ayan was not among the passengers. Maybe because Ayan cannot read English she went to the departure hall instead of the arrival hall, said another Sudanese man. The man said that in order to comfort Malwal after he heard the president of the association spoke out his mind. The man had noticed that Malwal's soul might depart from his body after the president said his bride was not among the passengers. So, Malwal and the others ran to the departure hall to search for the missing bride. By then, Malwal was sweating profusely and his body was shaking from head to foot. Whenever someone spoke to him he responded only by nodding his head. Malwal lost his voice when the president of the association confronted him at last with the fact that his bride had not come. Before he spoke such a life and death sentence, the president consulted 3 offices at the airport to make sure that Malwal's bride had not boarded the plane at the Khartoum airport. When the unpleasant fact was forced on Malwal, his physical strength could not support his body anymore. He collapsed on the spot. He was rushed to the hospital. The Sudanese people who came to receive the bride followed the ambulance to the hospital. As soon as their cars' engines started and their vehicles raced behind the ambulance, their cell phones began to spread the sad news across the city. That day the news traveled more quickly than the speed of the cars. Every Sudanese man or woman who received the news passed it on to 3 or 4 other people. In less than 1 hour, over 400 cars reached the general hospital. The hospital authorities were disturbed by the huge gathering of the Sudanese community and were worried about the patient's health. Due to the lack of proper communication and misunderstanding, the hospital staff thought that someone murdered the patient's bride on the very day of their wedding. This erroneous report was thrown at the visitors by the hospital staff, and by lunchtime 70% of the Sudanese people believed it and passed it on to their friends and relatives. Meanwhile, Malwal remained in coma for 1 week before his brain began to function properly again. Malwal was left with no choice except to take the great risk of traveling to southern of Sudan to search for his missing bride. Before he left the United States of America, Malwal did not leave a stone unturned trying to solve the mysterious disappearance of his bride. Through the Sudanese church pastor and the leader of his community, Malwal was able to contact many people in Sudan and inquire about his bride. The inquiry took 3 months before at last Malwal made up his mind and decided to fly to Africa. After great efforts, the pastor of the Sudanese church and the president of the association were able to collect enough money for Malwal to purchase his ticket and carry with him an extra couple of $100. Before Malwal flew from America to Kenya, he gathered some conflicting information about his missing bride. Some Sudanese people in the States were able to persuade their relatives and friends who lived in Sudan to risk their lives and go to Ayan's village and find out what had happened to her. Those people had to be paid by Malwal before they were persuaded to take such a risk. He spent over $1,000 on those informants. Some of them had just spent the money for their personal needs and forgot about Malwal. Only a few of them were honest and went to Ayan's home village. They found ruin and desolation, which told them nothing and yet everything. One informant concluded that some evil people attacked the village, killed everyone, and stole the cattle and the women. The informant did not want to come to a hasty conclusion of who the evildoers were. He reported that the village was destroyed and most probably the bride perished with her people. The second informant reported likewise, but accused the Janjaweed of committing that hideous crime. The third informant put the blame on the northern Sudanese soldiers who often did such a cowardly massacre. The fourth informant came up with a possibility that even Malwal refused to believe. He said a fight between the southern rebels and the villagers took place regarding food. The rebels won the battle because they had machine guns, whereas the poor villagers used white weapons to fight them. When the rebels finished the slaughter of the poor villagers, they took their cattle, food, and young men and women and then burned out the village. The rebels spared the lives of the young men and women because they needed more people to join their cause. So, Ayan most probably had now become a rebel fighter in the jungle. Yet, more suggestions and information reached Malwal that were not worthy of mentioning. Malwal had trouble with the Khartoum government before he fled Sudan. He could not travel directly to Sudan. Instead, he landed in Kenya with the hope of smuggling himself across the border into the south of Sudan. Many Sudanese friends in America tried to prevent him from taking such a risky trip to Africa. They argued that if he managed to avoid the rebels in the jungle, he might become a victim of the Sudanese government army. The government army consisted of military soldiers and Muslim voluntary fighters known as Mujahideen, or holy war fighters. The Muslim voluntary fighters were more dangerous and caused more trouble to the Southerners than the military soldiers. They looked at the Southerners as infidels and enemies of Allah and hence considered their fight in the south of Sudan as jihad. They came to the south of Sudan to spread Islam and fight the so-called enemies of Allah. They loved to die as martyrs because of the promise of the 72 virgins. The Quran made them to believe that Allah is going to wed each one of them 72 virgins in paradise. The virgins are believed to be faithful, beautiful, and eternally virgin. It said in a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that whenever the man has sex with one of his 72 girls, she would return miraculously virgin again. Every time the man de-virginized her, she would return virgin again, and that for eternity. The Virgin of Heaven did neither urinate nor defecate. She also doesn't menstruate nor becomes pregnant. Whatever she eats and drinks come out of her body as sweat. Her sweat smells like musk. Besides those 72 beautiful virgins, the Quran promised the faithful of rivers of wine, milk, and honey. Muslim women are not allowed to go for jihad. They said their holy wars are on their beds with their husbands. Muslim women have no promises of virgin men. The Prophet of Islam promised that the majority of women would go to hellfire. Lastly, Malwal was also warned of the possibility of falling victim into the hands of the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed militias were more brutal and dangerous than the Muslim Mujahideen. At least the Muslim Mujahideen fight against non-Muslim, but the Janjaweed kill indiscriminately Muslims and non-Muslims. Therefore, it was safer for Malwal to travel to hell than to Sudan. Nevertheless, all those dangers did not stop Malwal from making his trip to Sudan in search for his beloved Ayan. Malwal arrived in Kenya 4 months after the sad day on which he expected to meet his beloved bride at the airport. He landed in Nairobi International Airport one morning with a still bleeding heart, a confused mind, and a troubled conscience. When he reached Kenya, he had less than $100 left in his pocket. He had been given an address of a Sudanese family, who lived in Nairobi, so they could accommodate him for a day or two before he resumed his risky journey to the Sudanese border. The financial condition of the family convinced Malwal to leave the very next day. From Nairobi, Malwal travelled by a lorry to the Sudanese border. The nearest town that he could reach in Sudan was Naras. He spent his second night out in the open. He just found a small shack and slept near it. He was very exhausted and tired that night. When he woke up in the morning, he found his bag, wallet, and watch were stolen. Consequently, the American boy became penniless on the third day after his arrival in Africa. For a young and healthy man of his age to beg would be a shameful thing to do. He just decided to continue his trip on foot until he reached Naras. Very few people would walk on foot inside the jungle. There was the possibility of being attacked by wild beasts and eaten alive. This danger also did not hinder Malwal from continuing his advance toward Sudan. In fact, Malwal's knowledge of that part of Sudan was very little. He had lived most of his time in the southwest part of Sudan. He walked all day and never rested for long time. He was told that if he kept going he would reach the first town in Sudan before the sunset. Towards the evening, Malwal entered the town of Naras, dragging his exhausted body. He was thirsty and starving. A very old man saw him and greeted him, "Salamu alaikum Panjaz." Malwal did not like either the religiously loaded greeting or the fact that he was addressed as little boy. Nevertheless, he was told by his parents always to respect an old man even if he was worshipping Satan. "Walaikum al-salam grandfather," replied Malwal. "Where are you coming from and where are you going to, O Panjaz?" The elderly man squinted at Malwal, furrowing his eyebrows. Malwal spoke softly, "I am already a married man, Grandpa. I have come to search for my lost bride." The old man scratched his graying beard, showing two missing front teeth. How can a bride get lost if she did not run away with another man? It had never occurred to Malwal that Ian might have run away with another man. He had never asked himself before whether Ian was really in love with him or not. Did she in fact have another boyfriend but her parents forced her to marry him? Before Malwal could push his suspicion further, the old man spoke again. "Two of my young wives left me recently and went to the refugees camp in Nairobi. I heard that they met other men in the camp and slept with them. The last news I heard about them was that they married those men and immigrated to America." The old man shrugged his thin shoulders and hung his head. "Have you divorced them already?" Malwal could barely contain his curiosity. Again the old man raised and lowered his shoulders, breathing in deeply. "Not yet, my son, but what would a word from my mouth do?" Malwal scowled. "What they have done is wrong." The old man smiled and patted Malwal on his shoulder. "A woman's heart does not know right and wrong. Only fear of a father or a husband makes a woman do right and not wrong." Malwal shook his head, feeling the color rising in his face. "Women are human beings, Grandpa. They do right and wrong like men." The old man smiled and raised thin grey eyebrows. "You are still young, my son. You have no experience with women yet. Even the Holy Quran warns us against the cunning of the women, which is great." Malwal wanted to argue further, but he thought the old man was insane. Why did he believe that every human being on earth believed in his Quran? Instead he asked, "You have not told me yet, Grandpa, how far is Capoeira from here?" The old man's head jerked up, his eyes grew wide. "Why do you want to go to Capoeira?" "I am looking for a way to get to Bahr al Ghazal province." Shaking his head, the grandfather spoke slowly. "Bahr al Ghazal? Why have you gone to Kenya then? You would be killed before you reach Juba." Malwal thrust out his chin. "I must go there no matter what is going to happen to me." The old man pushed himself up, leaning on his gnarled wooden stick. "But you have taken the wrong route. You must have come through Uganda or Ethiopia." He waved the stick in the air. From there a UN helicopter could have flown you to Bahr al-Ghazal. I heard that the Red Cross and UN staff help people to fly in their helicopters to Bahr al-Ghazal. Malwal was tired. He rubbed his eyes before answering. I had no choice, Grandpa. Someone in America gave me the address of his relatives in Kenya. I know no one in Uganda and Ethiopia. The old man leaned in close to Malwal, stale breath blowing into his face. Then, go to Capoeira and there try to find those NGOs to help you to get into Bahr al-Ghazal. Malwal looked around him, one hand up to his forehead to shield his eyes from the setting sun. How far is Capoeira? The grandfather showed his toothless smile. A day if you run like a deer and a week if you walk as an old elephant like me. Malwal thought for a moment and said, a day if I walk fast. Grandfather pursed his lips, one finger to the side of his mouth. Maybe two, but it should not take more than that for a young Panjaz like you. Grandpa, said Malwal with a voice that sounded like a person who might fall dead any moment if he did not get an immediate help, I have no money or shelter. I have walked all day and I need to rest for the night before I resume my walk tomorrow. The grandpa threw open his arms, nearly falling off balance. Then, come to my hut and keep me company for the night. You are young and strong and can fight a lion or thief if they come to attack me. After he spoke those words, the old man took a handful of snuff and flung it into his toothless mouth. He tried to laugh, but could not, his mouth was too full. That night Malwal slept like a log. The old man continued to speak to himself for an hour thinking that Malwal was still listening. From the time he brought his guest to his hut, the old man talked about one topic. Malwal should accept his advice and return to Kenya and fly back to America. With heavy eyes, Malwal rejected the advice and fell asleep. The old man went on and on explaining why his guest should not take a risk and go to Capoeira. If Malwal had remained awake for half an hour and heard the horrifying stories the old man had told, he would have dropped his plan and returned safely to America. On the next morning, the old man had trouble waking Malwal from sleep, but it was the guest who requested his host to wake him before the sunrise. Before he left that morning, Malwal had a breakfast with the old man, who packed some water and a little food and gave them to his guest. Luckily, the rain season was over just a few weeks before Malwal arrived in Sudan. By then, the high road was dried up, making the walk less difficult. Malwal walked as fast as he could and rested only briefly. He was in a hurry to reach the city Capoeira before the sunset. An old woman with her daughter and her daughter's 3 children told Malwal that they had been walking for 3 days since they left the city. This report frightened Malwal and made him speed up. If he had known what awaited him in Capoeira, Malwal would not have been in a hurry to get there. The tragedy happened just 3 hours before his arrival. As soon as he reached the outskirts of the city, he was arrested by the government patrolling truck and taken as a war prisoner. He was accused of being a rebel spying for the SPLA, Sudanese People Liberation Army. Malwal pleaded for his release, but the soldiers showered his face with blows and kicked him with their heavy boots. Then, they hurled his half-conscious body like a sack of grain into their military truck and headed to the city. His hands and feet tied up with ropes, Malwal landed hard on the floor of the truck. With the speed of the vehicle, Malwal's face kept bouncing on the truck bed like a football. He constantly begged the soldiers to assist him, but they mocked and cursed him instead. As a matter of fact, the soldiers hated the spies more than the actual rebels. Whenever they caught a boy or a girl whom they accused of spying, they would beat him or her until they would extract some information. As soon as they were satisfied with the interrogation of their victims, they would kill them. Because such an execution was against the Geneva Convention regarding war prisoners, the soldiers invented a method to get rid of the dead bodies. There was an old stinky lake located near their military base. This lake was used as a burying place for the victims. The citizens of Capoeira called it the Lake of Skeletons. The soldiers would open the stomach of their victim and dump his body into the dirty water. So far no man or woman ever escaped such a tragic end if she or he was accused of spying. Malwal was one of the 6 unlucky Southerners who were arrested that day and taken for interrogation. When he was dragged out of the truck and thrown into a small room, he found some detainees already there. They were all tied up to posts and they were bleeding from head to foot. Some of them had their faces so marred from the brutal tortures that Malwal could not make out whether they were males or females. Likewise he was dragged to a post and fastened to it. The soldiers left the room as soon as they became sure that Malwal was securely tied up. When the soldiers disappeared, Malwal tried to converse with the other detainees. Either they had become deaf and mute due to the torture or they were too scared to talk to him and reveal some of their secrets. For a week, before Malwal was arrested, the government soldiers and the Southern rebels had been fighting continuously over the city. Like a piece of bone that 2 furious dogs were fighting over. There were heavy losses in both sides. For 7 nights the rebels attacked the city. Every time they attacked, they were able to penetrate inside the civilian areas and get supplies of food and forcibly recruit new rebels. The government soldiers would not fire at them until they left the city in the early morning. Then, the soldiers would come out of their hiding places and chase them for a few kilometers and return to their base. This hide and seek was going on for 7 nights. On that day, a few hours after Malwal was arrested, the attack was resumed. The rebels came a few hours before their usual time. The entire city was dark. Every light was switched off by order. The military siren was sounding continuously. The city was rained on by heavy artillery. The rebels were determined that night, no matter how much the loss might be, that they would have to take the city. The attack was concentrated on the military base where Malwal was held captive. His ears were deafened by the bombardment. The rockets lit up the small room like flashes of lightning. Malwal concluded that his end had come. After a couple of hours the rockets stopped, but the sounds of machine guns still could be heard. Malwal heard the soldiers shouting some words of encouragement to each other. Their shouting indicated to Malwal that the rebels were too close. "Fight as martyrs and give thanks to Allah for the paradise," shouted one soldier in Arabic language. "Allahu Akbar," responded another soldier. "Death is truth and life is false," shouted yet another soldier. Those words of encouragement did not last for long. Malwal began to hear the steps of fleeing soldiers. He expected some of the escaping soldiers to come in the room and open fire on them. Malwal saw a dark figure rush into the room. The figure switched his torch on Malwal's face. Malwal closed his eyes and waited for the bullets to hit his body. Instead he felt his hands and legs being released and heard a voice shouting at him in broken Arabic, "Take this Kalashnikov and fight." Malwal recognized the speaker as a Southerner. He took the gun and waited for further orders. "The city was already taken by our troops. We still need to clear it of the coward Arabs. Kill anyone who comes your way. Even those traitors who fight with the Arabs must be killed." Malwal ran behind the soldier who rescued his life and joined the battle unwillingly.